This is a fictional story inspired by real life. The continuous, unrelenting downpour of an early autumn rain had turned the grand avenues of London into a blur of dark, reflective tarmac and blurred streetlights. Inside the exclusive tailoring boutique, tucked away in a quiet, wealthy corner of Mayfair, the atmospheric chaos of the city felt miles away, muffled by heavy velvet drapes and thick plush carpets. Yet, the air inside was far from peaceful. It was heavy with the suffocating scent of lavender water and the unspoken tension of an impending transaction. Christopher Vance stood perfectly still upon a circular wooden pedestal covered in rich burgundy velvet, his gaze fixed straight ahead into a grand gilded mirror that stretched from the floor to the high ceiling. The reflection staring back at him was that of a man who had spent the better part of his 35 years learning how to mask his inner ruthlessness beneath a veneer of absolute, flawless sophistication. He was a man of tall stature, with broad shoulders and a sharp, angular jawline that remained tightly clenched as the master tailor, a small man with silver hair and nervous hands, fluttered around his legs. The charcoal gray suit Christopher wore was being crafted from a rare, heavy wool blend, cut exceptionally close to his ribs to intentionally conceal the bulk of the leather shoulder holster he refused to remove, even during these lengthy, tedious fittings. Behind him, lounging carelessly on an opulent leather sofa that had been imported from Italy, sat Victoria Sterling, her long legs crossed elegantly at the ankle. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek knot that accentuated the sharp, cold beauty of her face, a beauty that resembled a freshly forged blade rather than anything soft or warm. Her thumbs tapped rhythmically against the glass screen of her phone, sending out demanding directives to wedding planners, florists, and caterers whose names she would never trouble herself to remember. To Victoria, this entire affair was not a celebration of romance, but a carefully orchestrated merger between two of the most powerful shipping and distribution syndicates in the country. Her father's sprawling network in the northern ports was about to be seamlessly unified with Christopher's dominance over the southern docks, creating an unbreakable monopoly that would solidify their family's fortunes for generations to come. The wedding, scheduled to take place in precisely 48 hours, was merely the public signing of the contract, a grand spectacle designed to show their rivals that their combined strength was absolute and unyielding. "Do not breathe so heavily, Christopher," Victoria murmured, her voice carrying a cool, detached tone that didn't even bother to mask her mild irritation. She did not look up from her screen as she spoke, her attention entirely consumed by the logistical nightmare of coordinating 300 high-profile guests. "The tailor is trying to ensure the break over your shoes is absolutely immaculate, and you keep shifting your weight. My mother called me an hour ago complaining about the floral arrangements. She believes the dark hydrangeas look far too somber for a wedding. I told her we are merging empires, not throwing a countryside carnival. The palette will remain white, silver, and deep black. It is non-negotiable." Christopher did not reply immediately, choosing instead to roll his jaw to alleviate the dull, persistent ache of a tension headache that was beginning to blossom at the base of his skull. He looked at Victoria's reflection in the glass, noting how entirely insulated she was from the harsh, bloody realities that funded the diamond ring currently resting on her left hand. "Whatever you want, Victoria," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any genuine emotion. It was an arrangement they both understood perfectly, an unspoken agreement where love was never invited, and mutual benefit was the only currency that mattered. As the tailor pinned the left cuff of the sleeve, driving a silver needle through the expensive fabric with a practiced, swift flick of his wrist, Christopher's focus began to drift away from the stifling boutique. His eyes wandered to the empty, shadowed space next to the wooden changing screen where a small writing desk usually sat, and a familiar sense of cold unease settled deep in his stomach. Eleanor Vance, no relation, though she had shared his surname through 4 years of absolute, unwavering professional dedication, was not there. Eleanor had been his personal executive assistant, his gatekeeper, and the quiet buffer between his chaotic, often violent underworld dealings and the sterile corporate front he maintained for the public. She was a woman of unremarkable height, who favored practical shoes, dark blazers, and possessed an unnerving lack of intimidation that had frozen seasoned enforcers in their tracks. Just last month, when a rival crew had crowded into Christopher's private office, shouting threats and attempting to flex their collective muscle, Eleanor had calmly walked right through the middle of them. She was carrying a heavy stack of shipping manifests and had politely asked a man twice her size to move his mud-stained boot so she could thoroughly vacuum the rug beneath him. She was always there, an indispensable ghost in the machine, until exactly 48 hours ago when she completely vanished without a trace. Christopher stepped abruptly off the velvet pedestal, ignoring the startled gasp of the tailor whose fingers were nearly pricked by the sudden movement. "Mr. Vance, please, the jacket is completely unfinished," the man protested, his hands fluttering in the air like panicked birds as he watched the heavy wool garment sway. "We are finished for today," Christopher said curtly, shrugging off the unpinned coat and tossing it carelessly over the back of an expensive armchair. Victoria finally lowered her phone, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together into a sharp, prominent line of annoyance as she watched him reach for his dark dress shirt. "Christopher, what on earth do you think you are doing?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly but maintaining its controlled aristocratic edge. "The wedding is in 2 days, and the photographer is arriving at the estate in less than 3 hours for the final portraits. You cannot simply walk out." Christopher buttoned his shirt with quick, impatient movements, his eyes dark and focused. "We have a potential leak," he interrupted, his tone shifting into that dangerous, quiet rasp that usually made grown men empty their pockets and speak the absolute truth. "Eleanor has not checked in, answered a call, or logged into the secure server for 2 days. That has never happened in 4 years." Victoria let out a short, elegant sigh that was dripping with condescension, crossing her legs as she leaned back against the leather cushions. "Your secretary? Christopher, fire her and hire someone who actually understands the immense stakes of this particular week. She is likely just overwhelmed by the wedding preparations, or perhaps she is intentionally avoiding you to negotiate a higher salary. Let human resources handle it. It is beneath your station to chase after a missing clerk." Christopher stopped buttoning his cuffs and turned his gaze fully upon his fiancée, looking at her with a profound, chilling clarity. "She is not a secretary, Victoria," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an icy weight that filled the small boutique room. "She holds the physical encryption keys to every single one of our offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She is the only person besides myself who possesses the handwritten ledger detailing the dock payoffs to the authorities in the Southern Harbor. If she has disappeared, she is either planning to sell that information to the highest bidder, or someone has taken her to get to me. Either way, it is a priority." Victoria stood up, smoothing down the front of her designer skirt with a practiced, elegant gesture that showed no signs of actual concern. "My father is flying in from Edinburgh tonight for the rehearsal dinner. Christopher, we have a reputation to uphold, and 300 guests are expecting to see a unified front. Send one of your drivers or security guards to find her apartment and retrieve the documents. You do not need to involve yourself personally in the management of a low-level employee." Christopher reached for his leather holster, strapping it securely across his chest and feeling the heavy, comforting weight of his custom pistol pressed tightly against his ribs. He shrugged on his heavy overcoat, his mind already miles away from the floral arrangements and the truffle risotto. "I do not send other people to handle my liabilities, Victoria," he said coldly, walking toward the heavy glass door of the boutique. "I handle them myself." The little brass bell above the door chimed a cheerful, mocking goodbye as he stepped out into the damp, gray London afternoon, leaving his fiancée standing alone in the warmth of the luxury shop. The air outside was thick with the scent of wet soot and asphalt, the sky above the city a bruised, ugly shade of deep purple that promised a worsening storm. Christopher walked briskly toward the black, armored SUV that sat idling illegally against the high curb, its hazard lights casting long, amber reflections across the puddles. His driver, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas, quickly flicked his cigarette into the overflowing gutter and scrambled into the front seat as Christopher climbed into the back. "Where to, boss?" Thomas asked, eyeing his employer's grim, unreadable expression in the rearview mirror as he put the vehicle into gear. "The East End," Christopher replied, staring out the tinted window as the first heavy drops of rain began to smear the glass. "Garrison Street. It is an old tenement block near the dead end of the industrial canal." Thomas hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hands tightening visibly on the leather steering wheel. "Garrison Street, sir? That is deep within the Northern Syndicate's territory. We are not supposed to have any presence there until the marriage certificates are signed and the territory agreement is finalized." Christopher leaned his head back against the leather headrest, closing his eyes. "Just drive the car, Thomas." As the vehicle navigated the dense, slow-moving London traffic, Christopher felt a knot of sharp irritation in his chest, slowly morphing into something cold, dark, and deeply unsettling. He paid Eleanor a salary that was more than generous, an annual sum that should have easily secured her a luxury high-rise apartment in Kensington, complete with a 24-hour doorman and secure underground parking. Yet, when he had demanded her home address from his head of security an hour ago, he had stared at the text message in complete disbelief. Garrison Street was a decaying, forgotten artery of the city's old industrial sector, a place choked with condemned brick buildings, rusted canal barges, and desperate people who lived entirely off the grid. It was the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights were intentionally shot out to provide cover for illicit trades, and the police only ventured when they were called to collect a body. Why was she living in a place like that? What kind of game was she playing with him? He began to meticulously replay the last time he had seen her, which was late Tuesday evening in the main office. The corporate headquarters had been entirely empty, the glass towers of the financial district glowing in the distance. Eleanor had been standing by the industrial shredder, quietly feeding old transport logs into the machine's metal teeth. He remembered thinking she looked unusually tired. Her skin, which was normally a pale, healthy cream color, had appeared sallow and completely drained of vitality. He had even noticed a faint, dark smudge along her jawline, partially concealed by a layer of poorly matched cosmetic concealer. When he had sharply questioned her about it, she had offered nothing more than a dry, flat smile and blamed an open wooden cabinet door in the archive room. Christopher had accepted the lie without a second thought because it was convenient for him, because he had a massive wedding to plan, and because he trusted her implicitly to always function perfectly. Now, a sudden, sharp twist of self-disgust turned his stomach as he realized he had willfully ignored the obvious warning signs of trouble. If she had taken the ledger to the Northern Syndicate to sabotage the merger, he would be forced to eliminate her. The thought sat heavy in his throat, a leaden weight that tasted like bitter ash. He did not want to harm Eleanor. He wanted to understand why she had disrupted his ordered world. The city shifted dramatically around them as Thomas drove further east, the glass and steel towers of wealth giving way to crumbling Victorian brickwork, rusted iron gates, and abandoned factories. The rain was falling much harder now, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the reinforced roof of the SUV that drowned out the sound of the passing traffic. The streets grew narrower, littered with overflowing commercial dumpsters and broken glass that crunched loudly beneath the vehicle's heavy, specialized tires. "Pull over right here," Christopher ordered as they approached a row of four-story residential buildings that looked as though they were slouching against one another for structural support. Thomas brought the vehicle to a smooth halt against the curb, his eyes scanning the shadowed doorways. "I should come inside with you, mister." "Vance," Thomas offered, shifting the gear into park and reaching for his door handle. "No," Christopher said, his voice firm and absolute as he checked the placement of his weapon. "Stay with the vehicle, keep the engine running, and watch the mirrors. If I am not back out in 15 minutes, call the main detail." Christopher stepped out into the pouring rain, the cold water immediately soaking through the heavy shoulders of his overcoat, though he did not run or quicken his pace. He walked with deliberate, heavy steps toward the crumbling stone entrance of the tenement building, noting that there was no electronic buzzer system or functional security lock. The glass panel in the front door had been completely smashed out long ago, temporarily patched with a warped sheet of damp plywood held together by rusting screws. He pushed the heavy door open, the old iron hinges screaming in protest as he stepped over the threshold and into the dim, narrow interior. The stench hit him the exact second he crossed the line, a suffocating, offensive cocktail of boiled cabbage, stale tobacco smoke, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap bleach trying and failing to mask something foul. The hallway was incredibly narrow, the walls painted a sickly, institutional green that was peeling away from the plaster in long, dry strips that littered the floor. A single, bare fluorescent tube flickered sporadically on the water-stained ceiling, buzzing with a high-pitched, irritating hum that sounded like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. Christopher's hand instinctively brushed against the left lapel of his coat, reassuring himself of the hard, metallic outline of his firearm before he began his silent ascent up the wooden stairs. The old steps groaned loudly under his weight, the sound echoing off the bare walls as he passed the second floor, then the third, his senses heightened to every sound. The muffled noises of desperate survival bled easily through the thin, uninsulated walls of the apartments, a young child crying relentlessly in the dark, the faint dialogue of a television show, and a fierce argument in a language he couldn't identify. This was a world of raw, unpolished reality, the exact structural opposite of the pristine, manicured environment he had just left in Mayfair, and the absolute opposite of Victoria's gilded life. He finally reached the top floor and located the door marked with a fading, brass-plated letter 4B. The door itself was a heavy, solid piece of weathered oak that looked entirely out of place in such a dilapidated structure, though the wood near the brass lock was deeply scratched and splintered. Christopher reached out his gloved hand, turning the knob slowly. It did not catch, as the entire internal latch mechanism had been completely broken from the frame. He pushed the door open, drawing his weapon from its holster in one fluid, highly practiced motion as he stepped over the threshold, sweeping the empty room with the dark barrel. The apartment was freezing, the air inside actually feeling colder and more stagnant than the rainy street below because there was absolutely no functional heating system. Christopher stood in the narrow entryway, his eyes blinking rapidly against the thick, gray twilight that filled the space. The shades pulled down tightly over the single window. He lowered his gun slightly, his brow furrowing in deep confusion as he took in the complete lack of domestic life before him. There was no furniture whatsoever. The main living room was nothing more than an empty, desolate expanse of scuffed hardwood floors with no sofa, no television, and no rugs. The only object in the entire room was a cheap, plastic folding table pushed flat against the far brick wall, upon which sat a bulky, outdated laptop computer. Next to the laptop was a neat, meticulously organized row of external hard drives and several heavy manila folders that bore the distinctive classification stamps of his own shipping firm. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice sounding incredibly loud, harsh, and intrusive within the hollow, echoing space of the abandoned-looking apartment. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind rattling the loose window pane and the relentless rain lashing against the glass. Christopher moved further into the apartment, his boots clicking sharply against the bare wood as he checked the tiny galley kitchen, finding the small refrigerator unplugged and empty. He turned down the short, dark hallway toward the small bathroom, and that was the exact moment his eyes caught the dark, rusty brown smears on the old linoleum floor. They were not light splatters of blood, they were thick, distinct drag marks, the unmistakable trail of someone who could no longer lift their own body weight. The sharp, unmistakable metallic scent of copper cut through the damp cold of the hallway, causing Christopher's pulse to quicken against his throat as he followed the dark trail to a half-open door. He pushed the door wide, his weapon raised, but the sight that met him caused his breath to catch completely in his chest. Eleanor was sitting on the cold floor, her fragile body wedged tightly into the narrow, uncomfortable space between a chipped porcelain bathtub and the base of the toilet. She was illuminated by a single bare light bulb hanging from a frayed wire above the sink, her body trembling violently from a deep, systemic chill. She was not dead, but her appearance suggested she was rapidly losing her battle to remain among the living. She wore an oversized gray shirt that was soaked with sweat and blood. Her bare legs were splayed out awkwardly across the linoleum, and a thick, blood-stained towel was wadded up and pressed hard against her left thigh with fading strength. Her head lolled heavily to the side against the edge of the tub, her skin the color of old, translucent parchment stretched tight over her cheekbones. The small bruise he had noticed on her jaw on Tuesday had blossomed into a massive, ugly sprawl of deep purple and yellow that covered half her face. She was not holding a phone, nor was she holding his missing ledger to sell to his rivals. She was holding a curved sewing needle, threaded with thick, black nylon string. Her fingers were shaking so violently that she could not find the physical leverage to push the metal through her own torn flesh. Christopher froze in place, a man who had built an entire commercial empire on the foundation of strategic violence, who had watched men fall without his heart rate increasing. Yet, the sight of his quiet, unassuming executive assistant attempting to stitch her own deep wound in a freezing bathroom felt like a physical blow to his chest. He dropped his expensive firearm onto the porcelain edge of the sink, where it landed with a heavy, metallic clack that shattered the silence of the room. Eleanor's head snapped up slowly at the sound, her eyes, which were usually so incredibly sharp, intelligent, and observant, now glassy and unfocused with a raging fever. She stared at him through the haze of her pain for a long, agonizing moment, recognizing his face but lacking the strength to offer her usual professional greeting. She did not scream for help, nor did she shed a single tear. She merely let out a dry, rattling breath and allowed her head to drop back heavily against the tub. "You are tracking mud across the floor, mister." "Vance," she rasped, her voice sounding like crushed glass being dragged over concrete. Christopher fell to his knees beside her on the cold linoleum, entirely unconcerned with the fact that his expensive trousers were soaking up the filth of the floor. He reached out, his large hands hovering over her trembling form for a fraction of a second before he gently but firmly pried the sewing needle from her fingers. "What happened to you?" he demanded, his voice sounding far too harsh, loud, and cracked within the fragile silence of the freezing bathroom. He did not mean to sound angry, but the sudden panic rising in his chest had nowhere else to escape. "Who did this to you, Eleanor? Tell me their names. Please do not yell at me," she whispered softly, closing her eyes tightly against the light of the bare bulb. "I have a terrible headache." "Eleanor, open your eyes and look at me," Christopher ordered, grabbing her chin gently to tilt her face upward, noting that her skin felt burning hot to the touch. "Who shot you?" She let out a weak, entirely humorless laugh that quickly dissolved into a painful hacking cough. "Nobody shot me, Christopher. Do I look that careless? It was a knife. A very large, very ugly blade." He pulled the blood-soaked towel away from her thigh to examine the damage, his jaw tightening as he saw the deep, jagged laceration that ran across the muscle. Someone had intentionally dragged a heavy blade across her leg, clearly attempting to hamstring her to prevent her escape, and the edges of the wound were already inflamed and angry. Severe infection had clearly already begun to set in, threatening her life far more than the sluggish bleeding that remained. "Why did you not call the syndicate's private medical doctor?" Christopher growled, grabbing a clean section of the towel to apply pressure. "Why did you not call my personal line?" Eleanor flinched sharply as the pressure was applied, a soft hiss of agony escaping her split lower lip as her knuckles turned white against the tub. "Because the private doctor reports directly to your Uncle Charles," she panted, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "And your Uncle Charles. He has been working secretly for the Northern Syndicate for months." Christopher went perfectly still, the sound of the blood rushing in his ears, suddenly resembling the roar of a distant ocean. "What did you just say?" Eleanor opened her eyes again, the fever still clouding her vision, but the sharp, cynical intelligence that made her entirely indispensable to his daily operations cut right through. She looked up at him with a profound mixture of exhaustion and pity, as if she were looking at a man who had blindfolded himself to the world. "The entire wedding merger. It is not a partnership, Christopher. It is a completely hostile takeover from within your own ranks," she explained, her throat clicking dryly as she swallowed. "The Sterling family isn't joining forces with you. They are absorbing your territory, and the strike is scheduled to happen tonight. They plan to use a tasteless toxin at the rehearsal dinner, ensure it looks like a rival family's retaliation, and leave Victoria as the grieving widow. Your Uncle Charles has already routed the payoff money through the catering accounts, and I went to intercept the physical courier carrying the digital ledger on Tuesday. The courier was a Northern enforcer. He was much faster than I anticipated, but I secured the encryption drives. They are on the folding table outside." Christopher stared at her in absolute silence, the heavy atmosphere of the bathroom stretching out until it felt like wet cement pressing down on his shoulders. He thought of Victoria sitting in that luxury Mayfair boutique, complaining about the specific color of the hydrangeas while she quietly planned his funeral. He thought of his Uncle Charles, the man who had embraced him at family gatherings, now orchestrating his execution for a percentage of the southern shipping lanes. And then he looked down at Eleanor, a woman who lived in a freezing, empty box of an apartment, bleeding out on cheap linoleum to protect him. "Why?" Christopher asked, the single word stripped entirely of his usual command, sounding like a raw, desperate inquiry from a man who realized his empire was built on sand. "Why did you not bring this information to me immediately at the main office? Why are you living in a place like this?" Eleanor allowed her head to roll toward his shoulder, a faint, tired smile ghosting across her pale lips. "Because you were picking out custom Italian suits, Christopher. You wanted this merger to succeed so badly that you completely stopped looking into the shadows. If I had brought this to you without absolute, ironclad physical proof, you would have assumed I was merely trying to sabotage your wedding. And I live here because my mother's specialized medical care costs $8,000 every single month. The facility in the countryside is beautiful. They have lovely gardens for her." Christopher felt a thick, painful knot form in his throat, realizing that while he paid her a substantial salary, she was sacrificing every penny to ensure her mother's comfort. She had chosen to live in complete hidden squalor, so that he would never perceive her as vulnerable or view her family situation as a professional liability to the firm. "Hold perfectly still," Christopher commanded, his voice dropping into a low, rough rumble as he pushed his expensive overcoat aside and rolled his sleeves up to his elbows. He did not ask her permission. He reached for the small, pathetic first aid kit sitting on the toilet lid and pulled out a bottle of antiseptic. "This is going to burn terribly, Eleanor," he warned quietly. "Just do it," she gritted out, her hands gripping the porcelain rim of the bathtub with all the remaining strength she possessed. He poured the liquid directly over the jagged slice in her thigh, and Eleanor's back immediately arched off the floor, a strangled, guttural sound tearing from her throat as she bit down hard on her own shoulder to keep from screaming aloud. Her small body trembled violently under his large hands, but Christopher's jaw remained locked as he threaded the silver needle with mechanical, steady precision. He had sewn up his own operational men before in hidden basements and dark alleys, but this felt entirely different. Every puncture of the needle through her pale skin felt like a direct indictment of his own blindness. "You are remarkably heavy-handed for a man who wears bespoke clothing," Eleanor gasped, her forehead slick with cold sweat as she relaxed slightly. "You should have let the courier go, Eleanor," Christopher said, his voice hard as he focused entirely on pulling the nylon thread tight. "You are an administrative executive, not field muscle." "I protect my desk," she snapped back weakly, though her voice lacked any real heat. "And you sit directly behind it. You could have died in this room." "Well, I am not dead yet," she murmured, her eyes fluttering closed. "So stop nagging me." He tied off the final stitch, snipping the thread with a pair of small, rusted scissors from the kit, and began wrapping her leg tightly with clean gauze to stem the remaining fluid. As he worked, he noticed other faint marks on her skin, a silver scar near her collarbone, a faint burn on her wrist that she had always hidden beneath long sleeves. She was a map of quiet, unacknowledged corporate warfare, having taken the metaphorical hits meant for his empire for years, only to hand him his morning coffee with a blank face. He finished the knot on the bandage, remaining on his knees on the dirty floor, as his dark shirt became stained with patches of her blood. Suddenly, a sharp, intrusive electronic ringing shattered the quiet of the apartment. It was Christopher's secure burner phone, a number known to only 3 people. He did not move to answer it, his eyes remaining locked on Eleanor's exhausted face as her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. "Answer it," she whispered softly, her eyes opening slightly. "It is almost noon. She will be calling to demand your final decision on the seating arrangements for the pavilion." Christopher reached into his pocket and pulled out the vibrating device, the bright screen displaying Victoria's name in the dim twilight of the room. He hit the accept button and brought the phone to his ear, his eyes never wavering from Eleanor's pale countenance as he listened to the sharp tone on the line. "Where on earth are you, Christopher?" Victoria's voice was tiny, impatient, and cutting through the speaker. "Thomas said you insisted on driving deep into the East End for some absurd reason. The head caterer is currently threatening to walk off the estate if we do not finalize the truffle risotto versus the wild mushroom options within the hour." Christopher looked down at the dark, drying blood that had settled into the creases of his knuckles, his expression turning into something terrifyingly calm. He thought of his Uncle Charles. He thought of the poison destined for his plate, and he felt the old monster within him awaken fully. "Victoria," Christopher said, his voice carrying an icy stillness that usually preceded a total demolition. "Listen to me very carefully. There is no risotto, there is no rehearsal dinner tonight, and the wedding is completely cancelled." A long, suffocating silence stretched across the digital line, a heavy void where Victoria's aristocratic composure completely shattered. "Excuse me?" she finally hissed, her voice dropping its polite facade entirely. "You cannot cancel this wedding, Christopher. Do you have any comprehension of what my father will do to your shipping lines? This is a legally binding merger." "It was a hostile takeover, Victoria." Christopher corrected her softly, his eyes watching Eleanor's heavy eyelids flutter as the fever continued to pull her down into sleep. "And your father is going to discover very shortly that every single port in the South is permanently closed to his vessels. Tell him the courier he dispatched on Tuesday morning was incredibly sloppy with his work, and tell him my executive assistant sends her regards. Do not call this number again." He did not wait for her furious response. He clenched his hand, crushing the cheap plastic screen of the burner phone until it fractured into a dozen pieces before tossing it carelessly into the dry bathtub. He turned his attention back to Eleanor, who was looking up at him with a terrible, bloody, and completely exhausted smile that was entirely genuine. "You completely ruined that 3,000-pound suit, boss," she murmured right before her eyes finally slid shut from exhaustion. "I always hated the suit anyway," Christopher replied softly, rising to his full height without a moment of hesitation. He slid one powerful arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, completely ignoring her faint groan of protest as he lifted her fragile form off the cold linoleum floor. She weighed almost nothing, a realization that enraged him all over again. How little space she required, how easily she carried the immense weight of his multi-million-pound empire while starving herself of a basic life. He carried her out of the narrow bathroom, past the empty, freezing living room, and out through the splintered wooden door into the pouring rain. "Where are we going?" she mumbled against his chest as they hit the stairwell. To my estate, Christopher answered firmly, his boots kicking aside broken glass as he descended. To my personal physician, and then, Eleanor, you are going to tell me exactly how we are going to tear the Northern Syndicate down to the absolute studs. The journey back to the private estate in the Surrey countryside was a masterclass in suffocating, tense silence as the heavy vehicle tore through the rain-slicked streets. Thomas drove with a reckless, precise speed that threw Eleanor's unconscious body against Christopher's chest, but he merely clamped his arm tighter around her shoulders, his jaw locked tight. When the heavy iron gates of his secure compound finally parted, Thomas slammed the brakes outside the main entrance before the vehicle had even come to a complete halt. "Get Dr. Victor!" Christopher snapped fiercely as he kicked his door open into the downpour. "I want him in the East Wing guest suite in less than 3 minutes." He carried Eleanor through the cavernous marble foyer of his home, his muddy boots leaving dark prints across the immaculate floors, the sterile luxury of the house making him feel physically ill. He deposited her gently onto the center of the sprawling king-size bed, the stark white duvet instantly beginning to absorb the dark red fluid seeping from her thigh. Dr. Victor, the syndicate's private physician, arrived breathless moments later, his medical bag tightly clutched in his hand as he took in the scene with wide eyes. "Is that Miss Vance?" the doctor asked, immediately dropping to his knees to assess her vitals. "Fix her," Christopher ordered flatly, backing away toward the tall, arched window to allow the medical professional room to operate. He watched in silence as Victor expertly cut away the ruined gray shirt and began flushing the jagged wound with a harsh, chemical-smelling antiseptic solution. "Her core temperature is dangerously high, Christopher," Victor muttered, hooking up a clear IV line to her arm. "Severe dehydration, physical exhaustion, and the wound is deeply infected. Whoever did this twisted the blade intentionally before pulling it out, but she will keep the leg if we can break the fever tonight." Christopher crossed his arms tightly, the damp silk of his shirt clinging to his skin like cold iron as he watched Eleanor's motionless face. "When was the last time she ate a proper meal, Victor?" Christopher asked, his voice entirely devoid of its usual authority. The doctor sighed, checking her pulse once more. "Her ribs are practically bruising her skin from the inside out, Christopher. Her immune system is completely depleted. It is as if she has been running on nothing but pure adrenaline and black coffee for an entire year." The words struck Christopher like a physical blow, forcing him to remember the lavish catered lunches he frequently ordered to his private office while she sat outside his door, quietly maintaining his empire without complaint. "Pump her full of whatever antibiotics you possess," Christopher commanded quietly. "If she requires a blood transfusion, take it directly from me. I am a universal match." Victor paused, looking over his shoulder with a sharp, evaluating gaze. "Christopher Vance does not bleed for his staff, he bleeds his enemies." "She is not staff," Christopher said coldly. "Just do your job, Victor." By 3 o'clock in the morning, the grand estate had fallen into an absolute, heavy silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the main foyer. Christopher sat behind the massive mahogany desk in his private study, a cleaning rag in his hand and the disassembled components of his primary firearm laid out before him. The encrypted hard drives sat in a neat, impenetrable stack next to his elbow, holding the digital secrets of the conspiracy that had nearly cost him his life. He had already attempted the standard syndicate bypass codes, but Eleanor had locked the data down with an advanced algorithm that he couldn't even begin to crack without her assistance. Suddenly, a soft, dragging friction sound from the hallway caught his attention, a sound that did not belong to the heavy, tactical tread of his perimeter guards. Christopher stood up instantly, his hand dropping toward his shoulder holster, as he silently moved to the study door and pulled it open. Eleanor was leaning heavily against the dark wooden door frame at the end of the long hallway, looking like a fragile ghost in the shadows. She was wearing one of his oversized black button-down shirts, which fell past her mid-thigh, her left leg encased in a heavy medical brace that kept her knee completely straight. Her right hand gripped the aluminum pole of her IV stand, using the wheeled device as a makeshift crutch to support her weight as she dragged herself forward. Her face was a mottled canvas of deep purples and sickly yellows, her hair a tangled mess against her neck, but her dark eyes were violently awake. "Get back into that bed, Eleanor," Christopher ordered, his voice a low, commanding rumble across the polished floorboards. Eleanor did not listen, taking another agonizing step forward that caused the small wheels of the IV stand to squeak loudly in the quiet house. "I heard the vehicles arriving outside, Christopher," she rasped, her voice thin and completely ruined. "You are pulling the guards from the harbor detail. I am redirecting the security force to reinforce the perimeter of this estate, Christopher explained, closing the distance between them in 5 long strides to prevent her from collapsing. You are bleeding through your fresh dressing. Go back to bed. You cannot read the encrypted drives without me, she countered, completely ignoring his directive as she leaned her full weight onto the metal pole. You do not possess the digital encryption keys, Christopher. You are flying entirely blind into a war zone tonight. Christopher stared down at her, the sharp scent of the doctor's antiseptic lingering on her skin, mixed with the faint smell of dry paper and rain that was uniquely hers. I can handle my uncle and the Northern Syndicate without a spreadsheet, Eleanor. No, you cannot, she fired back, a spark of genuine professional irritation breaking through her immense physical exhaustion. Your Uncle Charles didn't just root the catering funds. He gave them the exact defensive layout of the South Armory. If you go to war tonight without knowing what he sold, your men will be slaughtered. Her chest heaved from the immense effort of speaking, the final remnants of her color draining rapidly from her face as she suddenly swayed dangerously on her good leg. Christopher caught her by the waist before she could strike the floor, his large hand splaying flat across the soft cotton of his shirt as he pulled her flush against his chest. Eleanor gasped loudly, her hands flying upward to grip his forearms for balance as the physical contact sent a sudden jarring shock through both of them. For 4 long years, they had existed in a sterile, perfectly professional orbit, never once crossing the invisible boundary of the executive desk. Now, she was pressed firmly against him, her body burning with a fierce fever, while her heart hammered against his ribs like a panicked bird trapped in a cage. "Let me go," she muttered under her breath, refusing to meet his intense gaze as she looked down at his collar. "You are going to collapse, Eleanor," he said softly. "I am going to the study," she corrected him, her voice tight with a strange, defensive panic. "I need my laptop computer." "You need a proper hospital," Christopher replied, shifting his grip to lift her once more, but her short fingernails dug tightly into the skin of his arms. "Christopher, please," she whispered, the unexpected word stopping him dead in his tracks. She never said please. She organized, she executed, she informed, but she never begged for anything. He looked closely at her face, seeing the raw, unfiltered terror pooling in her dark eyes. A terror that had nothing to do with the Northern Syndicate, but everything to do with being useless. She had starved herself and lived in squalor to prove she could handle her own burdens, and the concept of being completely helpless terrified her more than a bullet. 1 hour, Christopher compromised, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You give me the access keys, you show me the logistics, and then I am sedating you myself." Eleanor offered a ragged, bloody smirk. "Deal." He wheeled his massive leather desk chair around to the front of the mahogany desk, refusing to let her walk a single extra foot, and dragged over a heavy wooden stool to prop up her injured leg. Eleanor did not waste a single second. She pulled the laptop toward her, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a rapid, mechanical precision that bypassed the first layer of security. Christopher stood directly behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on the high leather back as he watched lines of glowing code scroll past on the screen. "You are shaking, Eleanor," he observed quietly in the darkness. "Caffeine withdrawal," she lied smoothly, her teeth chattering from the deep chill that refused to leave her bones. Christopher turned and walked to the small wet bar in the corner of the room, pouring a finger of aged amber whiskey into a crystal glass before setting it next to her trackpad. "Drink this. It will help open your blood vessels and ease the chill." Eleanor eyed the amber liquid suspiciously before picking it up with a trembling hand and throwing it back in one swift gulp, coughing violently as the burn hit her empty stomach. A faint, healthy flush of color crept back into her cheeks a moment later. "Is that better?" Christopher asked. "Utterly disgusting," she croaked, setting the crystal glass down with a sharp click. "Okay, I am completely into the secure network now." The screen flickered brightly, revealing a massive, heavily indexed spreadsheet that served as a digital map of Christopher's impending ruin. "Filter the data by the last 30 days, Christopher ordered, leaning closer until his chest brushed against the back of her chair. Eleanor tapped the trackpad swiftly, truncating the list of transactions. "Here." Charles initiated 7 separate transfers from the shell company that handles the southern dock tariffs. They were small amounts designed to stay beneath the automated radar, but look closely at the routing numbers. "The Cayman Islands," Christopher said, his eyes narrowing to slits. "That is the Northern Patriarch's preferred financial institution." "Exactly, but it is not merely a transfer of capital, Christopher. Look at the attached architectural files, Eleanor explained, clicking on a small paperclip icon next to a transaction from Tuesday morning. A detailed blueprint filled the screen, displaying the primary shipping warehouse located on Pier 4. Large red markings indicated the structural weak points, the specific blind spots in the security cameras, and the exact physical location of the main electrical breaker box. That specific warehouse holds the entire shipment of restricted munitions we imported last week, Christopher said, the temperature in the study seeming to plummet. If the Northern Syndicate detonates that, the resulting explosion will level 3 full city blocks, and the authorities will blame us for domestic terrorism. They aren't hitting it to destroy it, Christopher. Eleanor corrected him swiftly, bringing up an intercepted email sequence that had been broken down into plain text. They are striking tonight to steal the munitions. Victoria's father requires your weapons to arm his own men for the final phase of the takeover. The strike is scheduled for exactly 4 o'clock in the morning. Christopher checked the heavy gold clock on his desk. It was precisely 3:15. And my Uncle Charles is personally leading the operational strike team, Eleanor added softly, her voice filled with a profound sadness. He dispatched an email confirming he possesses the gate bypass codes. The silence in the study became absolute, thick as wet cement, as Christopher stared at the name of the man who had taught him how to shoot as a boy. Christopher did not yell or smash any of the expensive decor. He merely inhaled the sharp scent of the rain from the open window and exhaled a long, cold breath. He is currently at Pier 4, Christopher stated flatly. He is already there, Eleanor confirmed, slumping back against the leather cushions as the adrenaline crash finally hit her body, her eyelids drooping heavily. He is waiting for the northern transport trucks to arrive. Thomas! Christopher barked toward the doorway without raising his voice, and the heavy door pushed open instantly to reveal his driver carrying a tactical shotgun. Gather the men in the armory. Suppressed weapons only. We are going to the docks, and we are going entirely silent. The industrial docks at Pier 4 smelled heavily of diesel exhaust, rotting kelp, and rusted iron as the black SUV brought Christopher to the scene without headlights. The rain had slowed to a persistent freezing drizzle that left the entire concrete yard slick and coated in a greasy, dangerous sheen. Christopher stepped out of the vehicle, his boots hitting the cracked asphalt without making a single sound, as he pushed the door until the latch clicked shut. Thomas fell in directly beside him, his weapon held at a low ready, while 6 additional men dressed in flat black materialized silently from the shadows of the stacked shipping containers. Nobody spoke a single word. They had all memorized the digital blueprints Eleanor had provided, and they knew every single blind spot. 3 transport vehicles are currently approaching from the southern access road, sir, Thomas whispered, pressing his communication earpiece deeper into his ear. Their suspensions are sitting high, they are empty, and arriving to load the munitions crates. Cut the main power to the halogen security towers right now, Christopher commanded coldly. When they kill their engines, we move. No survivors on the northern side. I want a total blackout. A heavy, metallic clunk echoed across the desolate yard as the main electrical breaker was thrown from the junction box, plunging the entire pier into an aggressive, suffocating darkness. The only remaining illumination came from the sickly orange glow of the distant city skyline, bouncing off the low-hanging rain clouds. Christopher unholstered his weapon, the cold metal feeling heavy against his palm as he walked forward, sliding silently between 2 towering stacks of shipping containers. He could hear the low, throaty hum of the northern box trucks rolling through the main gate, their headlights extinguished as they parked in a neat row in front of Warehouse 7. The heavy roll-up door of the warehouse was already standing wide open, and standing just inside the dry threshold was his Uncle Charles, holding a tactical flashlight. Christopher stopped 30 feet away in the shadow of a rusted crane, watching the older man pull a silver flask from his coat, unscrew the cap, and take a long, relaxed drink, as if he had already won the war. 3 large enforcers hopped out of the lead transport vehicle, carrying heavy assault rifles, and moving with the sloppy, unearned confidence of a crew that expected absolutely no resistance. Do you possess the access codes for the inner vault, Charles? The lead enforcer asked, his deep voice carrying easily over the sound of the dark water, slapping against the wooden pylons below the pier. They are already punched into the security console, Charles replied, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Make the transfer quick. Christopher is currently frantic searching the city for his missing executive assistant, and he won't realize the armory has been emptied until tomorrow afternoon. Christopher stepped out of the deep shadows, walking into the open concrete yard with deliberate, calm steps that caused the gravel to crunch softly beneath his boots. Charles saw him first, his entire body freezing mid-motion as the silver flask slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the wet concrete, spilling dark brandy into a puddle. "Christopher!" Charles choked out, his voice cracking with sudden terror as the three northern enforcers spun around rapidly, raising their weapons. They never received the opportunity to pull their triggers. From the darkness above the shipping containers, Thomas and the strike team opened fire with suppressed weapons that sounded like heavy staple guns. The engagement was brutally fast and mathematically precise. The lead enforcer dropped instantly as a round found its mark, while the second man took 2 shots to the chest and folded over the hood of the truck. The third managed to discharge a single wild shot into the night sky before Thomas's weapon took out his legs, sending him crashing to the pavement, where a final, quiet shot ended his screaming. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, ringing loudly in Christopher's ears as he continued his slow walk toward his uncle, who was now backed tightly against the corrugated metal wall of the warehouse, his hands raised in pure, unfiltered panic. "Christopher, wait! Please listen to me," Charles pleaded, his confident swagger completely vanishing into the cold night air. "It is not what it appears to be. They forced my hand. Victoria's father threatened my family. He said he would eliminate everyone I care about if I didn't provide the warehouse access." Christopher stopped 10 feet away, looking at the man who had bought him his very first bicycle as a child, the man who had poured expensive whiskey on his father's grave. "You do not have a family left to threaten, Charles," Christopher said quietly, his voice devoid of any anger or heat. "You have 2 ex-wives who refused to speak to you, and a gambling debt at the casino that maxed out at $3 million on Monday morning. You sold my life and the lives of my men to cover a bad streak at the card tables, and you used a northern courier to hide the paper trail. But you were incredibly sloppy, and my assistant found you out." "A secretary," Charles spat, a desperate, ugly sneer twisting his features as he realized pleading would not save him. "You are going to destroy your own bloodline for a glorified typist?" "She is not a typist," Christopher said, raising his weapon and locking his elbow with absolute certainty. "She is the woman who just ended your life." Christopher squeezed the trigger twice, the weapon barking softly in the rain, and Charles hit the concrete floor heavily, leaving a wide, dark smear against the metal wall as his eyes glazed over forever. Christopher lowered the firearm, the scent of burnt gunpowder mixing with the salt air of the harbor as he stood over the body for a long, silent minute, letting the cold rain wash over his face. "Thomas," Christopher said quietly as his driver stepped up beside him, "the transport vehicles are completely secure, and no further units are arriving from the north. Load the bodies into the back of their own trucks, drive them directly to the private airfield, and park them right in front of Victoria's father's private jet with the keys left in the ignition. And as for Charles..." Christopher paused, looking down at the silver flask. "Put him in the driver's seat of the lead vehicle. Let them see exactly what happens to their investments in my city." He walked back to his SUV, the intense adrenaline finally leaving his system, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion that settled into his bones as he drove away from the docks toward the only person who had actually protected him. When Christopher walked back into the pristine, lemon-scented foyer of his country estate, the sheer luxury of the environment turned his stomach, his thoughts remaining anchored to the freezing tenement building on Garrison Street. He walked down the shadowed corridor to his private study, finding the heavy brass knob locked tight from the inside, just as he had instructed. "Eleanor," he said softly against the wood, and a moment later, he heard the heavy wooden stool scrape across the floorboards before the deadbolt snicked back. The door swung open to reveal Eleanor slumped against the frame, completely swallowed by his oversized black shirt, her fingers white-knuckled around the spare weapon he had left her. Christopher stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him as he gently wrapped his large hand around the barrel of the gun, easing it from her rigid fingers and engaging the safety catch. "You didn't shoot me," he noted softly, his voice rough. "You knocked?" she whispered, her eyes scanning his stained clothing. "Is it finished?" "Charles is gone, and the Northern Syndicate will be leaving our territory by tomorrow morning," Christopher replied. Suddenly, Eleanor's good leg buckled beneath her, as the final remnants of her physical tension snapped completely, but Christopher caught her mid-collapse, scooping her up gently against his chest. He carried her past the mahogany desk, ignoring the laptop screen that still displayed his uncle's ruined plans, and walked straight into his private master bedroom suite, bypassing the guest wing entirely. The room was warm and inviting, heated by a large stone fireplace that cast long, golden shadows across the walls as he laid her gently upon the center of the massive mattress. I need to wash the soot from my hands, Christopher said, staring down at his stained fingers. Do not move from this bed. I cannot feel my leg anyway, she murmured softly as her eyes drifted toward the ceiling. He stepped into the ensuite bathroom, turning the water on scalding hot to scrub away the memory of the docks, before returning to the bedroom in clean clothing to find her staring quietly into the fire. Christopher sat on the edge of the mattress, his gaze fixed on Eleanor's pale, bruised face, as the warmth of the room began to break the remaining chill in her body. Dr. Victor specified that you require absolute rest and a proper nutritional regimen for the next 2 weeks, Eleanor, he said softly. My brain refuses to shut down, she replied, rolling her head to look at him. What happens tomorrow with the firm? The Northern Network is entirely out, which means we must restructure our maritime accounts by Tuesday, or the shell companies will flag automated regulatory alerts. Christopher let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, leaning forward to brace his hands on the mattress on either side of her shoulders, trapping her gently within his field of view. I have just dismantled a hostile corporate takeover, eliminated my own blood relative, and carried you out of a freezing slum, and you are currently quoting financial margins to me? Someone has to keep the books balanced, Christopher. You were completely blind without my oversight. I was blind to more than just the books, he corrected her softly, the rigid professional distance they had maintained for 4 years vanishing completely into the warmth of the room. Your mother's specialized medical facility is now permanently funded through my private family trust, Christopher told her, his fingers gently brushing against her unbruised cheek. The tenement apartment on Garrison Street is finished. Thomas is currently packing your remaining belongings, and then my men are burning that building to the ground, so no one can ever live in such squalor again. Eleanor's lips parted slightly in surprise. You cannot simply mandate the entire structure of my life, Christopher. I just did, he replied, his voice dropping to a low, rough register. You bled to keep me breathing, Eleanor. You are never returning to a small desk outside my door. You belong in this room, by my side. She swallowed hard, her dark eyes wide. I am merely your executive assistant. No, Christopher whispered, the desperate need for security in his chest settling into an absolute certainty. You are my partner, and if anyone ever looks at you with malice again, I will destroy everything they have built. Eleanor looked up at the dangerous man before her, realizing that beneath his violence lay a fierce, absolute devotion. I always preferred the wild mushroom option over the truffle risotto anyway, she mumbled softly, her heavy eyelids finally closing as sleep claimed her. The profound realization that emerges from the ashes of this conflict is one that shapes the remaining years of a mature life. The understanding that true loyalty is never found in the grand, public contracts we sign or the strategic alliances we forge for mutual gain, but in the quiet, unacknowledged sacrifices made in the shadows. As we grow older, the glittering spectacles of wealth, position, and structured partnerships begin to lose their luster, revealing themselves as mere illusions of security that can be shattered by a single act of betrayal from within our own circles. We come to understand that the individuals who truly anchor us to this earth are not those who stand beside us in the warmth of prosperity, complaining about the superficial details of a manicured existence, but those who are willing to bleed in the freezing dark to ensure our survival. It is an adult truth that a single, quiet soul possessing absolute integrity and unconditional devotion is worth more than an entire empire of transactional relationships, for when the storms of life arrive, the structures built on convenience will always crumble into sand. Christopher Vance did not merely cancel a multi-million-pound wedding. He burned down the false reality he had inhabited, choosing instead to build a new world upon the unyielding foundation of a partnership born from shared survival and mutual protection. In the end, the most successful takeover is never the one executed in the corporate boardroom or through the strength of arms, but the silent surrender of the heart to the one person who refused to let you fall in the dark.